Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Steve. This is one of the perils of being an FOG, friend of Galson. You get to be one of the first speakers at an important meeting like this. But it really is a pleasure to be here and see so many familiar and friendly faces out there. It's almost like a reunion for me, coming back and seeing so many people that have been involved in regulatory harmonization activities, which are so critical and what is the focus of our workshop. So I'm going to provide an industry perspective, and the usual disclaimer is I can't speak for industry. I can speak as a member of a regulated pharmaceutical company. So these are personal thoughts and clearly not representative of pharma or even probably my company. But why promote harmonization? I could probably end by just showing this slide and sitting down, but clearly there's been enormous benefits for the harmonization activities under the ICH rubric over the past 20+ years. Faster access to medicines globally, reduced duplication of effort and resources, fewer clinical trials needed, sharing of experience and knowledge amongst regulators, but also amongst affiliates within any pharmaceutical company. You can transfer information according to now standards that are widely accepted. And, of course, the optimal use of limited resources. Yes, even industry has limited resources and resource constraints that need to be managed. So what are our industry strategic priorities? And I think that it's fair to say that these are fairly obvious, but it is important. So increased probability of success. That is what we try to do with our pipeline. When we move products forward and work on targets, we're trying to optimize and use all the tools available to optimize and increase the probability of success of these targets and molecules becoming drugs. Reduce development cycle time, speed to market, speed to registration is important. Lower development costs overall. And then organic and inorganic growth in expanding economies. All four of these, I would contend, are facilitated by global development strategies which are enabled, completely enabled, by regulatory harmonization. So why does industry focus on globalization in addition to what I just mentioned? Obviously, it's all about access, and it's access along several different vectors. Access to scientific talent, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that, but that is something that is extremely important for the global pharmaceutical industry. There's talent now emerging in every nook and cranny of the globe, and accessing that talent to work on pharmaceutical development is critical. Access to patients to facilitate clinical trial accrual, as was alluded to. Access to lower cost suppliers and operational support, so to make the margins as low as possible and to do that efficiently and as economically as possible. And then finally, access to markets, be they private or public markets in the typical economies or in the expanding economies around the globe. So I'm going to show you a little slide. Tom alluded to this, the fact that there is a changing economic reality in the globe. This is what I call the homunculus of GDP, projected out to 2015. So the size of each country is represented by the size of their expansion of GDP. And you can see it's not the typical map we're used to seeing. Some countries are clearly on a growth trajectory. And that goes to my point about accessing those economies, accessing those talent, accessing those suppliers. Let me show you a more typical map of the world, and I can explain this one to you. It's a heat map basically showing the density of clinical trial research going on in each of the countries around the world. Red being hot, white being cool. And you can see that still, and this is a relatively old slide from 2008, but it's still holding. The trends are holding. The increased trajectories are probably changing a little bit, but you can see North America has a very dense activity in clinical trials. Western and Northern Europe has a similar type density. And then you can see some of the other countries around the world have activities going on. I would contend that since 2008, this has changed considerably with the advent of more simultaneous global development strategies, the involvement of these global countries involved in multi-regional clinical trials. We're probably seeing similar percentage increases in China and Japan for the global programs. But suffice to say, this is the point here is that harmonization facilitates this. Clearly having standards, having harmonized approaches to clinical trials, having regulatory acceptance of multi-regional clinical trial data in support of a regional approval is extremely important. And I think that was mentioned before, which is why we want to have the breakouts. One of the breakouts this afternoon is going to be speaking specifically on how we make the clinical trial infrastructure as efficient as possible, because that still is a challenge for multinational pharmaceutical companies. Just to give you an idea, the heat map doesn't really show you the trending, but it's hard to see, but I can read it to you. What I'm highlighting here are some of the non-Western countries, and the annual growth rate in clinical trial participation. So Japan is up double digits. China is up big time double digits, off a smaller base, of course, but 50% increase as of this polling. South Korea, 18%. Russia, 33%. Brazil, 16%. And the United States is contracting, as the last time we looked. So, the participation in global clinical trials is shifting. It's probably shifting even more dramatically now. And the typical Western economies are contracting with regards to clinical trial participation. This brings up, obviously, the issue of acceptability of foreign clinical trial data for regional registrations. This paper is now couple years old. It's from 2010, released by the CHMP. Basically, it's a considerations paper, reflection paper on what they're looking for. It's not necessarily a guidance, but it is a reflections paper, and the FDA also has similar publications I know that are in the works about this. They've struggled with some, even from my company, with some clinical trial data that shows regional differences. This is a struggle for regulators. So having a clear goalpost on what is acceptable, understanding what are the drivers of potential regional differences, not only in ethnic drivers that are defined by E5, but also potentially medical practice drivers that could be need to be understood before a multi-regional clinical trial is undertaken. A little bit about, we've come a long way with harmonization of requirements for registrations. We still have some room to grow here, some room to move on this. So I've highlighted four regions in particular that still require subsets or separate studies to support registration in those countries. I won't read them to you. I think most of the people that sort of play in this arena are pretty aware of the Chinese requirement for several hundred pairs of data and dedicated China PK studies. Similarly for Korea and Taiwan with the ICH E5 assessments. And then we're moving toward countries like India, Mexico, and Vietnam, where they actually need a prescribed number of patients in their clinical trials to support registrations in those countries, in those regions. That becomes difficult at times when you have a multi-regional clinical trial and you have to allocate a certain number or a certain percentage of patients. Japan has put out a very thoughtful, the PMDA MHLW has put out a very thoughtful document on what percentage of representation from Japan should be in a multi-regional trial that would support registration in Japan. Eventually those percentages add up, and sometimes they add up to more than 100%, which is the challenge that a pharmaceutical company takes. And then the different accrual rates that you can get to reach those targets are also a challenge. So sometimes the United States lags in your ability to get an adequate representation from the U.S. That competes with the overwhelming interest to basically reduce your cycle times and get these registrations as quickly as possible. So there are challenges. They can be guided by scientific insights, proper phase 2 dose ranging, proper understanding of ethnic sensitivities, but clearly facilitated by harmonized standards and harmonized data requirements. So these are some of the established harmonization initiatives. I think you'll be hearing about most of them during some of the talks throughout the day and tomorrow. I won't talk about ICH. Dr. Tominaga will give a very eloquent presentation on ICH later. The European Union, I think we can't overlook the fact that the European Union has come a long way with mutual recognition and now centralized procedures. I'm old enough to remember when you had to go for national registrations in Europe. That was, the young generation doesn't remember how hard that was. And now you have centralized procedures, you have common labels, all facilitated by harmonized technical requirements, but also facilitated, completely enabled by having a legal framework in Europe that allows that. WHO, Dr. Rago will talk a little about WHO. I'll mention it briefly later. We have the PICS inspection convention. So the mutual recognition of inspections is an important one, and then there's some FDA initiatives, the FDA EME QBD, Quality by Design pilot, really departing from the Q8, Q9, Q10 Quality by Design guidelines. There are some regional harmonization initiatives. Again, several speakers later in the day will talk about this. I'm a member of the ICH Global Cooperation Group. I had the privilege of chairing that group, filling some very big shoes from Mike Ward, who was actually one of the most successful chairs of the Global Cooperation Group, has really taken it into the next step. But we started that as a subset of the ICH Steering Committee, where we allowed regional harmonization initiatives, non-ICH regional harmonizations initiatives to join the Global Cooperation Group. And then we allowed, it was rechartered to allow individual drug regulatory authorities from countries that had contributed global dossiers with either patients or API supplies. And I think that's been a major step forward in the versatility and functionality of the Global Cooperations Group. I won't mention these others, and I think people will cover them during the talk. There are other initiatives out there which I think are all valuable and worth mentioning. The WHO Certificate of Pharmaceutical Products Scheme, globally accepted. I think that's been a very, very good initiative. It avoids duplicated reviews, especially for countries that WHO supports that have limited resources and really need to focus on what's important to them for their sovereign region. The WHO pre-qualification scheme, many of us are familiar with that, really facilitates fast registration of essential drugs. And then the regulators meet regularly under the umbrella of ICTRA to discuss additional regulatory harmonization concepts and initiatives. And then finally, Europe has, again, in the past, done some harmonization activities under the rubric of the Clinical Trial Directive. So really facilitating and standardizing clinical trial applications in the European region. So what challenges remain? One of the big challenges we see is regulatory capabilities. The gap between emerging and developed countries in their regulatory capabilities, not just capacity, but also expertise, is a major gap that needs to be addressed. And that's one of the focuses we have at GCG, which is training and capacity building for those countries that are really interested in adopting ICH and standard global guidelines. Clearly, we have to acknowledge that these countries have limited resources and they need to focus on their priorities within their regions. So some things are much more important to them than others. Some of the integrity of the supply chain for necessary pharmaceutical products is a high priority for many of those countries. The regional harmonization initiatives, again, the lack of sort of a legal framework that we see in Europe that facilitated centralized procedure, mutual recognition and centralized procedure. It doesn't exist in many of the regional harmonization initiatives, so it's more of a confederation approach where they're adopting in spirit guidelines, but there's no legal framework to make them binding. And then inter-regional cooperation basically is the way that needs to move forward and work. And then ICH, the focus on new chemical and biological substances and dosage forms, and the harmonization and life cycle management is probably another gap that needs to be thought about when we talk about the future of ICH. Clinical trials. I've spent a lot of time talking about the globalization of clinical trials, larger populations and faster recruitment. I think we do need to wrestle to ground a little bit better about the sort of the scientific expectations about regional differences, but also the expectation of having proportional representation in global clinical trials. and that issue about new regions with local proportional representation requirements. Quality standards, clearly, that's a major issue for the pharmaceutical industry and for global regulators, substandard products, understanding the expectations of regulators there and the capacity of regulators to actually conduct those assessments and ensure the integrity of the supply chain. And then GXP inspections, so duplicative re-inspections of sites, pre-approval manufacturing clinical trial sites. It's not unusual for a global pharmaceutical company to have a parade of inspectors coming in from different countries and from different regulatory authorities in different regions to do pre-approval inspections or pharmacovigilance inspections. I've been on both sides of this, being at the other end on the regulated industry side, one has to wonder about the incremental value and of some of these duplicate inspections. And there is an initiative evaluating this under the auspices of FDA, the European Medicines Agency, and the Therapeutic Goods Administration out of Australia with API. So the benefits of harmonization are clear. I hope I've been explicit on that. The standardization of quality, safety, and efficacy requirements and the format and content of regular documentation. Let's not lose sight of the fact this is a major accomplishment of ICH, to have a standard common technical document and electronic standards for submissions of these documents and individual case safety reports for pharmacovigilance purposes. This is a major step forward for us, for the regulators, to allow for information sharing, but also for the industry to avoid duplication. So there is reason for optimism. Moving forward, there's more work to be done. The progress in the CTA requirements and timelines, investment in clinical trial and human protection oversight infrastructures in some of the non-ICH regions, I think is good. One of the worries we have as an industry is that we're conducting clinical trials in regions that don't have sophisticated or adequate human subject protection oversight, the so-called ethics committees. We don't conduct research in countries that don't have that, and it does limit our degrees of freedom at times. Evolving understanding and impact of the ethnic and practice influences on the acceptability of foreign clinical trial data. And I think there's some reason for optimism here. One of the things I would point to, and Mike will talk about this, I'm sure, was the APEC, LSIF, and the Asian Harmonization Center and the tripartite initiatives being conducted by the Japanese, the Chinese, and the South Korean regulators. I think that's a major step forward in regulatory science that will inform policy and regulatory practice. So can we do more? I would contend, and hopefully we can have a discussion about this over the next 2 days. We can do more. Simultaneous global development, I put at the top. That is the industry's objective, simultaneous global development with near simultaneous registration around the world. I think that is an objective that we can work toward. It needs to be facilitated by some harmonized expectations around things like adaptive trials, clinical trial conduct, the acceptability of endpoints. That's a major issue when you're conducting a multi-regional clinical trial, especially for a novel therapeutic, is getting agreement on endpoints that are novel, including patient-reported outcomes. The requirements for companion diagnostics is quite deharmonized around the globe. There's probably some room for improvement there, or some room to move there. Pharmacovigilance and risk management is something that ICH has taken up under the E series, the E2 series. There's been some recent divergence of practice with some of the activities in Europe on the European pharmacovigilance legislation. And I think it'd be good to keep our eyes on the prizes of what we're trying to accomplish here, which is global pharmacovigilance and information sharing. I throw out HTA and reimbursement decisions as something that may be an opportunity for some harmonization. That is obviously an area of great interest to the pharmaceutical industry. We are now where we were with the regulators 20 years ago with the HTA authorities in the different countries and regions with regards to dossiers, documentation, and evidentiary requirements. So I think there may be some activities there. Supply chain integrity, track and trace expectations would be important. And then I had a brief conversation with Jeff Drazen outside before, over coffee, and the whole issue of data transparency and the release of primary data to the external world. is something that we're going to have to come to grips with, both as an industry, but probably also as academics and regulators, because those data are going to be out there. If we don't have sort of rules around that or expectations on what should be done with these data, obviously everyone will wind up being second-guessed with secondary analyses of these data being out there. So having some common expectations on that and discussions about data transparency and disclosure would be good. So my light turned red, and I think I'm done. I'll just sort of arrange these. I put Dutch up front, Bert. And however you say it, it means the same thing. I harmonized with thank you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Peter, and in particular, I want to thank you for ending on a note of optimism. We've all heard a lot of hand-wringing about global harmonization, and the fact that your experience has enabled you to be optimistic is very encouraging and should be encouraging for the whole meeting for the next couple days. Our next speaker is representing the perspective of the regulator. Herbert Lufkens is the chairman of the Dutch Medicines Evaluation Board. He's a member of CHMP, the Committee on Human Medicinal Products for the European Medicines Agency.